Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're immersing ourselves in the life of Saadat Hasan Manto.
A writer who, he died at only 42 back in 1955.
And he's still, you could argue, the most controversial and important literary figure of the 20th century in South Asia.
Absolutely. He was a genius, an alcoholic.
A devoted family man, which is a contradiction we have to get into. And just the most outspoken voice during one of the most traumatic periods in the region's history.
That tension is exactly what the sources you shared capture so well. Our whole mission today is to figure out how this writer, born in 1912, churned out so much work.
The numbers are staggering.
Oh, they are. 270 short stories, more than 100 radio dramas, film scripts, all while constantly battling obscenity lawsuits and, his own personal demons. We really need to cut through the legend.
You figure out why he was damned by critics as a filth writer.
A Khaka Nigari, yes.
Yeah.
And maybe more importantly, why his brutally honest perspective gave him this almost terrifying political foresight.
And Manto himself gives us the perfect mission statement for our deep dive today. He had this famous quote.
Oh, it's the best.
He said, "If you cannot bear my stories, it means the age is unbearable. I will not strip society, for it is already naked. It is not my job to clothe it. That is the job of the tailors."
And that refusal to be a tailor, that explains everything.
It's the core of his entire life.
It really is.
Yeah.
But to get why he became that person, you have to look at the pressure he was under from day one. Saadat was the son of a respected judge, Maulvi Ghulam Hassan Manto.
But he didn't feel respected at home.
Not at all. He felt deeply neglected, especially compared to the kids from his father's first marriage. He even wrote that he felt like a rejected creature and was scared of his father even when just looking at his picture.
Which just sets up this lifelong dynamic of rebellion. If his father wanted academic success,
Manto would be the worst student imaginable.
right? If his father gave him religious books, Manto would hide romantic, sometimes erotic magazines under his pillow. It was all a calculated act of defiance.
The academic rebellion is, I think, the most telling part. He was under so much pressure to do well on his matriculation exam. So what does he do?
He fails it on purpose.
Repeatedly. He only passed on his fourth try, and even then with a terrible score.
And here's the kicker, the detail that is just so perfect for his story. What specific paper did the greatest short story writer in Urdu literature fail?
The Urdu language paper.
You can't make it up.
It's a fantastic anecdote. It just shows you how formal systems can completely miss raw genius. He was struggling, drinking, failing his intermediate courses twice in Amritsar.
He said he was heading for a life of, obscurity or jail?
Exactly. For theft or robbery, he thought.
So how does this directionless, rebellious student suddenly become a literary rocket?
It just took one person to see his potential. While he was still deep in the drinking and gambling, he met Bari Alig, an editor.
And Manto gave him all the credit.
He said, "I am who I am today because of Bari Saheb." And Bari Alig didn't try to, fix him. He just channeled all that intense, dark energy into literature.
Into translation.
Yes. And not easy stuff either.
Yeah.
Oscar Wilde, Victor Hugo. And the sources say Manto translated Hugo's The Last Day of a Condemned Man.
A really dense, but
Incredibly dense. He did it in 10 to 15 days.
10 to 15 days. That's insane.
And just like that, his career was launched.
The translation work was clearly the launchpad. He moves into journalism in Delhi, starts on a tiny salary, something like 40 rupees a month.
But his talent was just undeniable. A few years later, he's in the heart of the film industry in Bombay.
He became a huge screenwriter. We're talking major companies like Imperial and Siraj. He was involved with Khaka Nigari, Filmistan, and then he co-wrote the script for a massive blockbuster.
The 1943 film Kismet, it was a monster hit. It made him a serious player in Bollywood.
And he was friends with the big stars.
Oh, yeah. At Bombay Talkies, he became close friends with the actor Ashok Kumar, who everyone called Dada Moni. For a time, Manto was a major commodity. When he moved to All India Radio, he was making 500 rupees a month, a princely sum.
It's just so striking that this guy, with his reputation for drinking and controversy, was at the same time a completely devoted husband and father.
He married Sophia in 1936. His mother chose her. They were basically strangers before the wedding.
But the relationship was, for the time, incredibly modern and loving.
It really was. His nephew describes him ironing his wife's saris, cooking, braiding his daughter's hair, feeding them by hand. He just rejected those traditional roles.
He even wanted her to call him by his first name, Saadat, which was a taboo.
She compromised with Saadat Sahab, but it shows you his thinking. And later, when he was broke, he legally signed over all the royalties from his books to her. total commitment.
He also suffered this immense tragedy. Their first son, Arif, died as a child.
A devastating loss. But it seemed to bring them even closer. It's this deep capacity for love that stands in such stark contrast to the cynicism in his fiction.
But that stability he found in Bombay, it all shattered with the partition in 1947.
It was a perfect storm, really. A professional slight, personal trauma, and total political collapse.
So first, the professional blow. His close friend, Ashok Kumar, rejects his story for the film Mahal.
And he took that rejection very, very personally. But the real catalyst was the violence. His wife, Sophia, was stuck in Lahore, and the brutality of the riots was just everywhere.
Which leads to maybe the most famous and darkest story from his life. He's drinking with his friend, the actor Shyam Sundar Chadha.
And Shyam, drunk and furious about the violence, just declares he's going to kill all Muslims.
And Manto, in his classic way, challenges him. He asks, "I'm also a Muslim. Will you kill me?"
And Shyam just laughs it off, right? Says something like, "You bastard, you're not really a Muslim."
Manto's reply is just chilling. "I'm enough of one to be killed."
And that was it. That exchange was the breaking point. He left for Lahore, Pakistan, literally without telling a soul he was going.
So Manto gets to the new country, but he wasn't looking for some kind of religious haven.
Not at all. He said his mission was to expose the political depravity, the siyasi haramzadi, in this new nation. He also, he feared Urdu would decline in India.
And his honesty immediately lands him in court.
Immediately. He faced obscenity lawsuits, fahashi cases, his whole career, but they really ramped up after partition, especially for stories like Thanda Gosht and Cold Dew.
He intentionally focused on the most condemned members of society, specifically prostitutes, or as he called them, Vegaja or Cosby.
He chose the Cosby, he said, because she was the most rejected creature of her time, and he used her to expose society's hypocrisy.
Right. How can you condemn this woman but allow the brothels she works in to exist?
Exactly. He pointed out the hypocrisy of men who wanted courtesan-like qualities in their wives, but demanded wife-like loyalty from the courtesan.
And when he was defending his work in court, he completely rejected the label of filth writer.
His defense was brilliant. He argued his stories were not meant to be sexually arousing shawarangais. They were meant to make you feel disgust.
To make you hate the acts being described.
Cold Dew is the ultimate example. The story about the girl who's been repeatedly assaulted during the riots.
Her father finds her, takes her to a doctor, and the doctor says, "Cold Dew, open up," meaning the window.
But the girl who's been reduced to this, conditioned response by trauma just reflexively unties her shalwar.
And Manto's defense in court was legendary.
He basically said, if you, the reader, feel aroused by this depiction of trauma, then the problem is with your dirty mind, not with my pen.
He saw himself as just a mirror.
And he connected all of it, all this moral decay and violence, back to one root cause. Hunger, bukha. He called it the mother of all curses. When people are starving, morality just collapses.
You see that collapse so clearly in his writing on partition. He always insisted it was 200,000 human beings killed, not Hindus or Muslims.
He said only a fool thinks you can hunt religion with a gun.
What's terrifying is how prophetic he was. I mean, he died in 1955.
And he was absolutely certain that war between India and Pakistan was inevitable. He basically predicted the 1965 war a full decade before it happened.
But his predictions were even more specific than that. In one story, he writes about characters who are afraid that India will cut off the rivers that supply Pakistan's farms.
Think about that. This is the early 1950s. He's writing about a geopolitical issue, water sharing, that is a massive point of conflict today. The Ravi River is now dry in parts because of it.
How does the story end?
With this incredibly dark metaphor, a character names his son Yazid. Yazid is a figure in Islamic history famous for cutting off water. And the character says, "One Yazid closed the water, perhaps ours will open it." It's just brutal, prophetic satire.
And he didn't spare the leaders either. That famous open letter he wrote to Pandit Nehru.
It's just so audacious, it's cheeky and a serious critique all at once.
He starts by pointing out they're both Kashmiri. He says Nehru means near a canal, and Manto means a unit of weight. He even calls them both guns that fail in the sun, which is a Kashmiri proverb.
It's a masterful way to get his attention. But then the tone shifts completely. He accuses Nehru of forcibly occupying places like Junagadh and Hyderabad. A hugely controversial thing to say then.
But the personal part is what's so incredible. He complains that Nehru is letting publishers in Delhi and Lucknow illegally print his books.
And not just print them, but publish this sensationalist collection called Manto Ke Fahash Afsane Manto's obscene stories right under the Prime Minister's nose.
And Manto's threat is just. It's pure Manto.
It's perfect. He says if it continues, he'll personally go to Delhi, grab Nehru by the collar, and stick to him until Nehru provides him with salted tea, bread, and turnip stew every week.
It's hilarious. But it also humanizes Nehru while tearing into his government's failures.
And he turned that critical eye inward, too. He was sympathetic to communism at first, but became really disillusioned with the intellectual elite.
He hated the hypocrisy.
He hated what he called the sofa comrades. These intellectuals sitting on soft cushions, drinking expensive tea, talking about the hammer and sickle, but completely disconnected from the actual suffering of the workers they claim to represent. He couldn't stand performative activism.
Sadly, the same chaos and passion that fueled his work also fueled his decline.
After he moved to Lahore, his drinking just got worse and worse. It led to liver cirrhosis, which killed him at 22.
His financial situation was dire, selling his things, begging friends for money.
And yet, even in that chaos, he was a literary machine. The sources say he once wrote 20 stories in 20 days just sitting in a newspaper office. The creative flow it never stopped.
His view on his own death is just as defiant. He predicted people would eventually honor him, and he wrote his own epitaph.
Final act of rebellion.
Here lies Saadat Hasan Manto, and he is buried under the earth believing that he is the greatest short story writer of all time.
And of course, officials later changed it, but that sentiment, that unshakable self-belief, that's what defines him.
I think his real legacy is how he stripped away the veneer from these huge, iconic figures. His sketches of Ashok Kumar or Muhammad Ali Jinnah.
They showed Jinnah as a flawed human, a man who loved his dogs and got frustrated. He brought these idols down to earth. He let you see the reality, not just the myth.
And his work is still so relevant because he was always focused on the internal struggles, the animalistic urges of human beings stripped bare by hunger and violence. He didn't care about flags or piety. He cared about the psychology of a survivor.
As he said, if anyone asks me which party I belong to, I will say I am alone. The day my equal is born, I will stop writing. The sources just show him as the singular voice who refused to compromise, even if it led to poverty and exclusion. He just held up that brutal mirror.
And we should remember, Manto said the solution was the job of the tailors, the politicians, the clergy, the lawmakers. So given his critiques of figures like Nehru and Jinnah, and his absolute hatred for those sofa comrades, which of today's untouchable institutions or sanctified activist movements do you think Manto would have targeted first if he were writing right now? That's something for you to consider as you dive deeper into his world.
He flips it and pulls them right back together with this inside joke. He brings up this old proverb that says Kashmiris are unreliable, like guns that misfire in the heat. It's such a brilliant move. He's laughing with Nehru about a stereotype, but there's a subtext, right? He's also saying, hey, don't underestimate us. We might seem a bit off, but we can both go off.
Okay, so the niceties are over. After building this delicate bridge of camaraderie, the tone of the letter just shifts on a dime. Montreno is ready to get to the real reason he's writing. And he just lays it all out there, point by point. He accuses publishers all over India, in Delhi, Lucknow, Jalandhar, of stealing his work. They're just reprinting his books, making money off his name, and it's all happening on Nehru's watch in his country. He even points to a specific example, his book Gunjay Freeshtay, or Bald Angels, which was pirated with a totally different title. And then he delivers this line, and you can just feel the sting. See, Manto was constantly being dragged into court in Pakistan, accused of writing obscene material. So for a publisher in India, in Nehru's capital city no less, to cash in on that painful reputation, it was a massive insult, both personally and professionally. He's asking Nehru, really? Is this the kind of thing you just let happen in your India? And this is where the letter becomes something truly special. Manto uses his own personal problem, his stolen book rights, as a gateway to a much, much bigger critique. He pivots from his own grievances to the stolen lands and identities of partition itself. And he does not pull his punches. First, he brings up India's annexation of Junagadh. To Manto, this wasn't some complex political move. It was simple. It was an unjust and illegal occupation. And he puts the blame for it right at Nehru's feet. And right after that, bam, he hits him with Hyderabad. He calls it a violent invasion where Muslim blood was spilled. You see,
For Manto, these weren't just abstract political events. They were violent acts of aggression that flew in the face of the secular, peaceful ideals Nehru was supposedly building India on. And then he brings it to the cultural level. He draws this sharp line between Nehru, the polished English language author, and himself, a writer of Urdu. And he flat out accuses Nehru's government of trying to systematically erase the Urdu language in India, a language that was once part of their shared heritage. Now it's not just about politics, it's about the very soul of the culture. So, after all the wit, the sharp anger, the political accusations, Manto brings this letter to a close with a climax that is, it's just unforgettable. He brings it back to the personal, but he elevates it to something, well, something like poetry. First, he gets in one last humorous jab. He says that if this new book he's working on also gets ripped off in India, he's going to personally come to Delhi, grab Nehru by the collar, and make him serve him Kashmiri salty tea every morning. It's this absurd, wonderfully intimate image that just snaps the focus right back to these two men, two Kashmiri.
And now we get to the final masterstroke. To end the letter, Manto tells Nehru a little story about a famous poet, Ghani Kashmiri. Apparently, an Iranian poet once visited Ghani's house when he wasn't home and left an unfinished line of a poem in his notebook. He'd written the second line, but he just couldn't figure out the first. And this was the line he left. Kind of weird, right? A little ominous even. What could it possibly mean on its own? From your clothes, the smell of roasted meat emerges. Well, when Ghani got home and saw the line, he knew instantly what the first line had to be. He wrote, "Which scorched soul has laid a hand on your hem?" And just like that, the second line makes perfect, devastating sense. The smell isn't coming from you. It's the smell of someone else's suffering that is rubbed off on your clothes.
And with that, Manto delivers the final, crushing blow. Panditji, he writes,
Ironically, the man who would one day be celebrated as one of the greatest writers in the Urdu language had a notoriously difficult relationship with the subject in school. Imagine this, the future master of Urdu prose failed his matriculation examiner do not once, not twice, but 3 times. It was only on his 4th attempt that he managed to scrape by with a humble 3rd division score. This early academic struggle is a powerful testament to the fact that creativity and genius cannot be measured by report cards or examination results. Manto's story proves that the confines of a classroom can sometimes stifle the very talents they are meant to nurture. His true education didn't come from textbooks, like the great English novelist Charles Dickens, who drew inspiration from the grimy streets of Victorian London. Manto found his voice and his stories in the real world. He learned from the struggles of ordinary people, the chaos of the streets, and the vibrant, often harsh realities of life. Unfolding around him, that was his university, and it gave him a degree in humanity that no formal institution ever could.